Kamelgard was only 12 years old when the Germans invaded his small rural village in Poland. And I know that, I don't know how much some of you know about the events that occurred during the Second World War, and specifically that befell the Jewish people during those years. I know that many of my students who are here today have been talking during the semester about people, different minorities who have immigrated to this country during the last 50 years or so, and we've also talked about different forms of oppression. And before I start to ask Mr. Kamelgard a few questions about his own experience, I'd just like to read to you one paragraph that really jumped off the page to me when I began reading his book, that I think everybody, regardless of their knowledge of the events, can really relate to. This is very, very early on in the book when Mr. Kamelgard, as I said, is only 12 years old. His life is still very, very peaceful. He's still living with his large family, all of whom are lost during the course of the war. But he doesn't know that yet. And he says about war: why does war happen? Why do countries disagree over issues to the point of wanting to destroy each other? As a child, I thought the whole idea of war was plain evil. After seeing genuine love flourishing in my household, I couldn't fathom leaders of countries ordering invasions of other lands or the murder of ethnic groups. Why would anybody deliberately take another person's life? After all, that violated the sixth commandment. Wonder as I did, the logic of war never made sense, even years later, when I witnessed brutal acts senselessly committed around me. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Kamelgard to you and ask him to share with us today, as painful as they are, some of the experiences that he had during those years of the Second World War. Mr. Kamelgard, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to CCBC today. Would you tell us a little bit about your town, what it was like before the war? Because I think for us in America in the 21st century, it's hard to picture what this small town in Poland was like before the war.
It was a small town in the center of Poland. We were surrounded by villages, farmers, and in the town there were craftsmen, tailors, shoemakers, and so on. And life was very peaceful. Most people were very poor. It was just a struggle to exist, but nevertheless, people lived and laughed and got married, and was a lively town until this terrible time of September 1939, when Poland was invaded by the Germans.
And, if you would continue, please, and
Okay.
tell us how your life changed so drastically upon the invasion in 1939.
I come from a very large family. We were 7 children, parents. My oldest sister was married and had 2 little kids. Every single one of them, during the period of 68 months, were killed, and I'm the only survivor. And not through any heroism, just by coincidence, I would say. In the beginning, when the war started, immediately the German law started to be implemented, and they were all oppressive. We weren't allowed to leave the little town. We weren't allowed to conduct business, and people were just living out of great poverty. And it had its toll, because lots of people started to die young and out of hunger and so on. But during these first 3 years, when war started between Russia and Germany, things started to get even worse. And again, we were like in a prison, because there was no way to escape or to run to another country where it was still not under the German occupation. Because for leaving the boundaries of the town, if you were caught, you were just shot on the spot. And all hell broke loose when the final solution started in 1942, when they came to liquidate our town, and at the same time the surrounding little towns. And I will concentrate on my own experience and from what I witnessed. When the first liquidation came about, my parents, my sister and I ran out to the fields to hide, and we had intentions to go to the nearby little town where my sister lived. And it took us almost 24 hours to arrive there, because we were not allowed, or we were afraid to walk with the real roads. So we had to walk in disguise. We arrived to my sister's, who the town was still intact, and we were there for a few weeks. And in my hometown, they allowed people to reorganize, and it seems that it was a scheme from the Germans. Instead of them having to run around and to kill individual people, they figured they'll allow people to organize, and then they will do the same thing as before. And that's exactly what happened. My parents and my sister and myself, we returned to our hometown at the time, and we still found 3 of my brothers, and the family was still intact. Other people had already been destroyed, have lost most of their families, but we still had the entire family, and I'm talking about the month of October of 1942. And one morning we found out that my sister's town was liquidated, and my sister, her husband, and 2 little girls were taken to be executed together with the rest of the people. So now we were left in my hometown, and we no longer had any place to go hiding if the liquidation will happen again. And sure enough, that's what happened. In November of 1942, they came to liquidate my hometown, and at that time there were only maybe 20% of the population, because the rest was all destroyed already. And my parents, my sister and I went to hide into a village with a farmer, and my 3 brothers went with the transport, and we never heard from them again. And now we found ourselves at this farmer's house, fearful, because it was very dangerous even for the farmer to hide Jewish people. And after 1 week, he chased us out, and now we were left in November. Snow was already on the ground, and we were left without any means of existence. And somehow we wound up in a nearby ghetto where there was still a few remnants of Jews living there. And we were there and without any hope of existence. And a day later, a young girl who was hiding with her family in a nearby farmer where we were hiding a day before, came to the ghetto and told us of a gruesome tragedy that happened the previous night. That's one day after we had left. The farmer took out the entire family and killed them all. And this young girl managed to escape and to arrive to this ghetto, which was a small town in Poland by the name of Wodzislaw, which is not important as far as the name goes. We were there under very, very difficult conditions, no food, no shelter, no means of existence. And finally, they announced in the papers that by January 1st, 1943, any Jew being caught in these areas will be executed, and they told us to go to a camp, to a ghetto in Krakow, and we wound up in that ghetto. In the ghetto, when we arrived, my parents, my sister and I, there were no means of shelter. We were in the streets, and finally we found out about a little synagogue which was still open, and they allow some people which have no place to live to stay over. And while we were there, one of my brothers, who was hiding with another family, his employees from before the war, arrived to the ghetto, and suddenly they came and they divided the ghetto into two parts, Ghetto A and Ghetto B. Ghetto A were for people who did work, and Ghetto B were for those that had no work. And very many places became available in Ghetto B because everybody knew that the very first liquidation will take place in Ghetto B. But to my parents it was like a savior, because suddenly they had a place where they could have a little room and to exist, knowing that their days are counted. And my brother and I were taken to a nearby camp near Krakow, where we built a new camp, and it was called Płaszów. And we were building the barracks over there for new inmates. And on March 13, 1943, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated. When I say liquidated, I don't mean just the people were chased out. They killed practically everybody, and a few people that were left alive, they were taken to Auschwitz and they were killed over there. And at that action, I lost my father, mother, sister, and one brother. And now I was up in the camp in Płaszów all by myself. At the time I was only 15 years old, because the war had already been taking place for 3 years. In Płaszów, it was a very, very terrible place to be. People were shot daily. We were very little food given. We had to work very hard, many hours. There were no breaks or anything for the inmates. When you went out in the morning to work, you had no knowledge whether you'll make it during the day, because the SS, or rather the German soldiers, walked around all day in the camp and at random used to shoot people without any reason. In one particular case that I can think of, I'll just tell you about an incident. I was working in one part of the camp where we were digging a well, and with me there was another inmate who didn't speak any German. I happened to know a few words in German, and we were sent to the kitchen during the night shift, and I had to pass a post where a German soldier was standing on guard. I don't know what he was guarding, because both sides of the fence there was the camp, and I came forward and I said to him, I stood erected, and I say to him, 2 people are going to the kitchen by the order of our foreman. He comes out from his post that he's standing in, and he starts kicking me and beating me, and not saying anything about what I did wrong. And I thought maybe I wasn't standing straight enough to him, and I again announced that 2 people are going to the kitchen. And finally, he must have gotten tired of beating me. He says to me in a shouting voice, he says, "Don't you know you're not people? You are prisoners." And then it dawned on me, instead I made a terrible, terrible mistake by saying 2 people. I should have said 2 Häftlings, which means 2 prisoners. And at that point, he kicked me and he says, "You can go." These are the conditions that we lived in. Another occasion took place also in that terrible place where I was for almost a year and a half. A group of us were sent out to unload carloads of material, and we came on our way back. While we were outside, some people came by and gave us some food, or we purchased some food from them. And on the way back, as we passed the gate, one of the guards noticed that we had bulk under our clothes. And he walked over and he started to shake some of us up. And he, of course, somebody had a bread falling out from underneath his coat, or somebody had some potatoes or something. And this was obviously a very big crime that we committed, in their eyes that is. And we were put on a side, and the camp leader, an Austrian by the name of Amnon Goeth, who was a murderer, a killer. They went to call him, and when he saw what took place, we were a group of 30 people. It was lucky that he didn't have his revolver with him, because otherwise he would have probably shoot half of us. Instead, he took the rifle from one of the guards and shot into the group. And then he shot again, and 2 people fell dead on the ground. And at that point, he ordered the shooting commando. They had a shooting commando. In addition to the individual shooting, that wasn't enough. But when it came to shoot a group of people, they had a special commando that came and took the people to a certain ditch in the camp and executed them. And he ordered that group to come to take us to that ditch. And then I realized that this is the end. I was only 15 years old at the time. And then, for some unexplanatory reason, he turns to us and he says, after beating us mercifully, he says, "If any of you will reveal where you have valuables hidden before you came to this camp, that may save you from being executed." No one steps out except me. And obviously I had nothing hidden before I came to the camp, but I remember that my parents, after the Germans came into our town, whatever little jewelry that my mom had, they buried in the ground in the cellar. And I figured I have nothing to lose, and I mentioned to one of the guards that my parents have some gold hidden. And with that, he changed his verdict, and he says instead to be the whole group should be taken behind a barrack, and they put out the tables, and they were flocking each one of us with the whips that they had. And there again, I kind of made a calculation, a quick calculation. Why should I have to watch how people are being beaten and then had to go through this horror? I will be the first one. I volunteered for the first one. And they put me on the table, and they started to beat me, and it was terribly painful, and I did the natural thing, I would scream. And suddenly I feel the metal at my head from a revolver, and one of the guards says, "If you don't start counting, I'm going to shoot you." And at that point I had to start counting, and I had to count to 50 until they stopped hitting me, and then the rest of the people were laying on the table and being beaten. And then this killer, Amnon Get, came by again, and at that point he changed again his ruling. As the person got off the table, which were practically half dead, they had to stand and say they had received their punishment justly. And if you didn't, you had to go back on the table again. And while this was going on, one person, for instance, I even remember his name, couldn't make it, couldn't even stand up. He went ahead, he took a brick, and he threw it all. He was a very big man, a big husky man, this Get, and he threw it at his head and split his head open. And then they threw him down and they took him away. He was dead, or maybe half dead. These are the conditions that we lived under. I'm especially detailing these incidents so that you get an idea how cruel people can make you live by what rules, and yet survive. That's the miracle. Then again, there were all kinds of incidents after that, and somehow I survived. And the following year, in May of 1944, they took a group of people and they sent them to the mines in Wieliczka, Poland. There's a place where there are salt mines, and I was among that group, and we went there for a few weeks to work in the mines. We didn't go to the mines to take out salt. We went down there to make floors, concrete floors, so that they can put the machinery for ammunition manufacturing. That camp only lasted 6 weeks, and most of you probably heard of about the attempt that they tried to kill Hitler in 1944. With that, they transported the camp into Austria because the Russian front was coming closer. For unexplanatory reasons, I have no idea why we were such an important commodity to these Nazis that they would waste railroad time where they had to transport military in order not to have us being liberated. I still don't understand it. And so then I wound up in a terrible camp in Mauthausen in Austria. That was around July of 1944. In Mauthausen I was there for about 2-3 weeks. And there again, they have created such a system where it was self-sustained. They took inmates and made them what they called capos, or foremen, or in charge of the blocks that we lived in, and gave them all the opportunity to be cruel. And where they were very cruel, because we had no recourse. We were beaten, and sometimes beaten to death. In Mauthausen, I stayed, as I said before, about 2-3 weeks, and then we were transported to another camp in Austria, which was called Melk. And something strange happened on our way to that camp. For some reason, we went in passenger cars, which we were I was very surprised. Suddenly, they're just putting us on passenger cars. I figured maybe that's some kind of a sign that we are going to a more humane location. But apparently they had no other cars, so they used the passenger cars. But we came into Melk, and it was again hell on earth. We were working in 3 shifts in digging tunnels for manufacturing of ammunition in these tunnels. And I mentioned 3 shifts. Don't get the idea that that meant 8 hours work. It sounds like 8 hours work, but the shifts were 8 hours in the tunnels. But when you came out, in order not to interrupt the work, the other shift had arrived to go into the tunnels to work. But from leaving the tunnels until arriving to the camp sometimes took an hour and a half to 2 hours. So that's another 3 or 4 hours to add to the 8 hours until you got into the camp. The camp, in this particular camp in Melk, for reasons that I have no knowledge, there was no shooting. They didn't shoot anybody, like in the previous camps. But they starved us to death, and they beat us to death, and they and the death tolls daily was like 60, 70 people would die a day in a camp where we were only about 7,000 people. So you can imagine how many people were dying. They built a crematoria in Melk, in that small camp. They had a crematoria because the dead couldn't be disposed of fast enough. They used to load them on trucks and take them to Mauthausen, because Mauthausen had gas chambers and crematoria. So that was too complex. I don't know the reason. So they built a crematoria in that small camp of Melk, and it worked obviously 24 hours a day to burn all the people that were killed or died. Again, not to burden you too much with details, in that camp I remained until April of 1945, and still surviving. In April of 45, they took us again. The Russian front was coming close, and again we were that so important they had to keep us for some reason. And we went out on a trip to a camp in Ebensee, which is in the mountains of the Alps in Austria. And again, we went by a boat on the river Donau, and we arrived to Linz. And that was already April, the beginning of April of 1945. And we saw, obviously we had no information about events that taken place. And suddenly in Linz we saw signs on the walls that Roosevelt died. They had some names for him, obviously, but that's the only thing we knew what's taking place, that Roosevelt died. And then from Linz we went on a dead march to Ebensee, which it took us about 2-3 days. Anybody that couldn't make it were shot on the side. I think it was like maybe 100 kilometers or maybe 80 kilometers. I have no idea, but it took us 3 days to go there. And then we arrived to this atrocious camp in Austria, Ebensee, and there again we encountered these inmates who were in charge, who were brutal. Many of them were German, most of them were Germans, but they were criminals. They were in the camp for a reason of having killed a mother or a father. And these were real criminals, and they were the ones in charge of us. In that camp, I realized that very long we cannot exist. And over there we also were building tunnels. And the difficulties were that in Melk the tunnels was clay. And clay is easier with air hammers to handle than in Ebensee. In Ebensee was rock. And there people were dying like flies. And suddenly, on May 1st, 1945, we are going to work as usual, and on the way one of the guards suddenly made an announcement that Hitler is kaput. Now, we knew that this must be something very, very important, because if Hitler would still, if they would still be in power, nobody would dare saying anything of that sort. And sure enough, we got to work, and suddenly the foremans, the civilian foremans, who were always very brutal to us, suddenly were humane. Suddenly they were acting like human beings. And there we found out that Hitler was killed, or killed himself, or whatever. And when we got back to the camp, suddenly these people that yesterday were killers or murderers or brutal individuals suddenly became humane. And that was the 1st of May, 1945, and that was a Wednesday, I think. And then the following day, suddenly they announced, whoever wishes can go to work, and whoever doesn't have to go to work. Suddenly they gave us a choice. It's funny, you know, as I'm talking about it. And suddenly, now we realize that the thing is over. And they changed the guards. And suddenly we walk over to the fence and we see old Austrian guardsmen watching us and suddenly waving to us, and suddenly like day and night. And but leave it up to them. They had some plans for us. On Saturday, which we are already in the 4th or 5th of May, we were called to the gathering place, the Appellplatz they called it, and suddenly they are making an announcement stating that the American armed forces are very close to come to Ebensee, and in order to protect us, they're offering us to go into the tunnels and to stay in order to be protected if there is some bombardment or something. Now, suddenly everybody started to shout, no, no, no. And again, this is so unusual because suddenly they gave us a choice whether we want something or not. It was unbelievable. And they didn't manage. The next day, Sunday morning, the American tanks came into the camp. For an unexplanatory reason, I remained in the camp that night, that Sunday. If you ask me why, I would look at you blank. I have no idea. I had no place to go. I had nobody to go with. So I thought maybe the Messiah will arrive during the night or something. Where is he going to go? He's going to come to our camp, and I'm going to miss him. Well, anyway, that same night, we suddenly heard a lot of explosions. And it turned out that these Nazis were mining the tunnels, trying to put us in there and to blow us up. But apparently their calculation was wrong, because when they finally finished their mine, the mines laying the mines, it was too late, and they no longer had any power to impose on us, because they didn't have to ask us. All they had to do was chase us in there, and we would have gone. And the next morning, Monday morning, I left the camp with 4 more inmates, and we never looked back. And the rest of my life since then is unimportant, because it's been normal, like everybody here, and that's my story. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Thank you. In July of 1952.
You said the rest of your life is unimportant, but I'm just interested in, say, maybe like the following year. Like, what did you do after you didn't have anything to go?
For the first 3 years, I must say, I had no money, I had no means, you would say, but when we came to it, after the liberation, one day I lived in Ebensee, and I had no place to go. So suddenly 2 trucks with Israeli soldiers came to the village and asked any of the youngsters that wished to go with them, they are willing to take along. And for some reason, I wasn't too anxious to go, for, again, no rhyme or reason. And one older person, when I say older, he probably was about 28, an older person, said to me, "Why don't you go with these soldiers? You're going to have somebody to care for you." I said, "I don't know." He says, "What do you mean you don't know? You have nobody else. Go ahead." He wishes that he would have the opportunity to go. So that influenced me. I went with them, and they took us to South Italy. And in there was, you must have heard of UNRWA. Today they call it UNICEF or something. That was an organization, I don't know by whom, financed probably by the United States, like all other organizations. And we were there organized in small groups. We were groups of kids like me. In November of that year, meaning in 1942, no, I'm sorry, 1945, they took us to Israel. And we arrived into Israel, and there we already went into a agriculture school. And I was there for only about 10 days. Those were days that the British blockaded Israel by refugees, not to allow refugees to come in, because they had to be politically correct. Even though these refugees had no place to go, they couldn't go back to Poland or to Austria, to the places of slaughter. They wanted to go to Israel, and the British said no. There's a problem. But our group went legally. Again, I don't know why. And we got in Israel. I was there only about 10 days, and these refugees were arriving, which weren't allowed to come in, and the British opposed them. So they organized youngsters to go to mingle with them and to disrupt the British, the soldiers from stopping these people to come in. And I was arrested. again, thrown into a camp in Israel called Latrun. I was there for over 2 months, and obviously conditions were pretty good as far as the way I was used from a camp. But the trouble was, I didn't know how long they're going to keep me. In other words, they didn't take me before a judge and they said, you're going to be here for 3 months or 6 months or a year. I had no idea how long they're going to keep me. And that really was very, very hurting. And then all of a sudden on February 1st, 1946, they called my name that I can leave. And I went back to my agriculture school. I was there for another 2 months, and suddenly they discovered that I have a lung illness, TB. And I remembered as a youngster, when I was back home, that anybody with TB is dying, because usually they used to be very, very thin and dying people. But I looked in the mirror, you can see in the back of my book, I don't look like I'm dying. So apparently they must have found something on my lungs or something, and they took me to a sanatorium where I was spent a year and a half, something of that sort. And then I came out and I got a job, and everything was hunky-dory. Anybody else?
I guess I have a comment instead of a question. That is, I think as we're listening to you, we're putting ourselves in your shoes, trying to think, could we survive? Could I have survived that time? But I think an even greater horror that not everybody can put themselves in this for their parents. I'm the father of 2 small boys.
How old?
2 and 1.
Oh, they are small.
And I just couldn't imagine being helpless like the parents must have felt to protect my children. It's one thing to kind of be in fear for your own life, but to be in fear for the lives of your children is indescribable. And so, and is just grotesque horror of the Nazis and anybody that would harm a child, harm a baby. It's unforgivable.
Don't forget another thing, and I want you all to be aware of it. I only gave you 1/1,000,000th of what took place. I went through, I don't know how long it took me, I went through 68 months and 5 days in a short while. Each minute, surviving each minute was an accomplishment. And when I talk about, when I told this Nazi that my father had hidden gold in the cellar, for the remaining days that I was in Płaszów, I was still in Płaszów after that about 8 to 10 months. I feared if they come and take me to my hometown and to show them where, I had no idea. They would have cut me to pieces. Luckily, nobody bothered me. So if you believe in miracles, that's what you can charge it to. And you say you were thinking whether you could survive or not. I asked that question many times my children. I asked them that same question. Do you think, from knowing what I went through, what I went through, do you think you could survive? And of course they have no answer. I guess I underestimated my strength. I guess that's what I can attribute it to. And even though it's been last Sunday, the 6th of May, 62 years since I was liberated. I think about these things all the time. There's no time. This is not something like you can make closure, what they call, or something. You cannot make closure on these things. And especially my family. I was the youngest in my family. I had 4 brothers, young, capable people. My parents, young. I had a married sister who had 2 children with a terrific husband, and all this is gone.
Obviously going through that kind of experience of the psychological wounds that you must have been through. And
Well,
in looking back toward Germany and the Germans, what was, how could you look at them?
I guess I have no hate in my heart. I guess my upbringing, even though I only spent with my family the first 15 years of my life, we didn't know what it means to hate anybody, you know. I even spoke to the professor today about Germany. Right now, in Germany, there are probably less than 5% of the population from that era. So, I don't want to imitate the Germans. They hated you for what you were born. Am I going to hate people that had nothing to do with it? I mean, of course, if you would bring before me Amnon Get, who was hung in Krakow in 1946, and I testified against him. I was in Israel at the time, but I testified against him in the consulate. If you would bring him before me, I don't think I would have any problem shooting him. But if you bring me his son that was born after the war, what? You're welcome. So hot in here.
Yes. We have a problem with climate control sometimes. I think this is a question that we all, when I teach the course and when we study these things, that we all ask ourselves the most critical question: why do we study? Why do we study the subject, the history and the literature of this period? What can we learn from studying it? Is it important to study these events? If we do, will it help us? Will it help humanity in some way to I don't know, to prevent, to act differently? What do you think, people? Is it important to hear what happened, to study what happened? Is there hope for humanity? Is there more hope if we know what happened? Yes.
Yeah, for me, I would say it's a good thing because sometimes people, for instance, sometimes people willingly take their life because they went through some trauma only because their friend didn't trust them for certain things, or because their cousin hated them or some family hated them. But he went through that, and I'm another witness of what he went through. I was only 4 years old when my country had a war. His was a country to country, but mine was like family to family, and people brutally killed people for no reason. And he happened to survive from that, and he's still saying that he still forgives you even if you come up to him. So it should be a lesson for those who haven't experienced that no matter what, there is life, even though you don't like me, but once I have the life and have the opportunity to do what best I think I can do in the eyes of those who understand that what I'm doing is right, to encourage everybody that there is still life. You don't need to commit suicide because it's a common thing that happens nowadays. More people commit suicide, and they haven't, I guess some of them haven't heard that most people have gone through trauma more than what you think. So don't take your situation so big and, in capital handle life, something that I guess I could take my life. What's about him? He who went through all of that, and he was only 15. I was 4, and I went through that. So it should be an encouragement that no matter what, there is life, and it should be taught so that those who haven't had the experience should not go through any process of killing themselves or getting into any trouble. It should be helpful.
Wow.
Fantastic.
So it teaches you to value life.
Yeah,
Thank you. Where are you from?
Liberia.
Liberia. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, thank you all very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I know it's end of semester. Thank you so much.
For inviting others.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We'll be selling them. These students are giving a presentation at the conference in a couple weeks, so they asked me to take this
Yeah,
one.
you can
So
copy it.
that's one of my tips. So you can talk to them.
My stepfather, he works over at the Student Success Center, so he couldn't come over here. And he wanted to see it,
the
but
fellow
he
that
was
was
going to
supposed
ask
to
if
take
they were going
Mr.
to talk.
Kamelgard home.
Yeah, I'm gonna make a copy for those. So talk to Alex about it. He'll have the copies for them.
It'll take me an hour.